we've got a good number of people here. But look, thank you very much for joining us today for our Microsoft Teams Learning webinar. My name is Mark Tyers, I'm the co-founder of Formation Tech, and I'll be chairing today's session. With us today, we also have two of the most well-respected and knowledgeable MVPs from the world of UC, Tom Artbutnot and Chris Hord. Thank you very much for joining both.
Hey, everybody.
In our sort of back room here, we also have Mike Gilroy-Scott, our head of technology, who has equivalent experience in this space, and he's on chat to answer any questions you have either during the session or at the end. So the topic of today's webinar, Teams Voice, what's holding you back? I'm going to touch on some of the trends we're seeing in the voice market today. The market's changed beyond recognition over these last 3 years. In fact, Formation was founded with the purpose of moving companies' legacy infrastructure to the cloud, focusing on UC and CC. And before hybrid working, voice was very much a standalone offering. When we were moving infrastructure to the cloud, it was very much about taking legacy infrastructure that was performing that singular function and moving it to a more stable, more secure, more accessible platform in the cloud. And unified comms at that time was often talked about, and it meant things like voicemail to email integration, screen dialing and soft phones. And that was often delivered by these either on-site PBXs that were moved to the cloud, by sort of multi-tenanted cloud hosted platforms. But broadly, it was a singular offering. Now, with the advent of remote working, voice is now driven by, in fact, is more just a part of collaboration. It is simply just another way to communicate, which actually, whilst fairly significant volumes of traffic are now catered for by IM and video and all the other things we use day to day for collaboration, users still need to make and receive calls. If you think back to when PBXs first revolutionized voice, before PBXs, you had single analog lines. You had one number, it would ring maybe one person or maybe one group of people. But in fact, the PBX revolutionized the way businesses worked by allowing numbers to route to groups of people, to ring in different fashions, to ring through IVRs and all these sorts of things. And so that's still important today. But what we're seeing more and more is that whilst these features are relevant to businesses, what we're seeing businesses wanting to do is to simplify and consolidate platforms whilst keeping to that same founding purpose. And I'll say the customers we're talking to who haven't already moved to Teams, we're falling into 3 categories broadly, I'd say. There's legacy phone systems we talked about a moment ago, and it might be there's perceived barriers to moving some of the infrastructure to the cloud or to Teams in the matter of this webinar. There could be certain features or functions which we're going to touch upon, or it might just be that IT teams have been very busy these last couple of years, moving lots of things to the cloud. So in fact, voice is just the last thing they're considering, maybe redundancy. Then there's those who have moved to hosted solutions. They move from on-premise to hosted, but they're still effectively running a siloed application. And finally, they're the early adopters. Those ones that move to the full collaboration solutions, the 8x8s, the Ring Centrals, huge uptake of that over the pandemic. The real sort of winners of the sort of stock market. But interestingly, whilst those visionary companies really did have a good idea where things were going, and businesses who adopted them had equally a good idea that they were taking on technology with a view to how things might be, and that this is really now how things are, and businesses are actually using these technologies, collaborations, IM and video and document sharing, and a lot of that is now in Teams. And interestingly, we're 24, 36 months into a lot of those contracts, and a lot of people we're talking to right now are actually looking to say, well, so much of it's done in Teams. What is the opportunity to do voice in Teams as well? But look, but back to the topic of the webinar. The first topic we've got here is around analog devices. And if this has been a barrier, there are many solutions out there that can extend the life of these devices beyond the big switch off. And fundamentally, if this is what's held you back, the clock's ticking really. So Tom, look, we were talking in advance of this webinar about some of the use cases and solutions to address this problem. Can you perhaps touch on a couple of problems and examples you've seen in this space?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's definitely a conversation, and particularly with the PSTN switch off and the analog switch off coming. I think it's important to define what we're talking about, because these topics get mixed. And one is BT, OpenReach, like the network turning off analog lines into businesses, and the other one is you probably have analog lines in your business, your lift phone, maybe modems, faxes, alarms that are hanging off of the PBX. So you need to consider both. And one is if you've got any external analog connectivity coming in, like direct lines for like alarms from your carrier, how do you deal with those? And the other one is you've got those phones hanging off the internal PBX, and if you're moving to a cloud PBX, you need either a provider or an SBC on site connected to Teams to continue to maintain service to those devices.
Yeah, because I think a lot of businesses have seen that. In fact, when we talk analog, you could actually wrap that into legacy, and that could be legacy IP. So you take legacy SIP devices, because a lot of people now, when we go and sort of roll deployments out, they might have had a handset per person. Now we're finding like low digit percentages, if some have them at all. So these same devices are running multiple different types of technologies, from pop phones to analogs to IP. And in fact, Microsoft have got that in the cloud as well now. I mean, it was previously just deploying SBCs, but do you want to perhaps maybe to touch upon the availability of that in the cloud as well?
Yeah, so Microsoft have a service called SIP Gateway, so you can directly SIP register SIP-based devices, although only a certain subset of approved devices. And it's more about migrating existing SIP phones over to Teams, but you can also register a session border controller, a box that will allow you to then interconnect an analog device. So again, either providers can do that on your behalf and kind of manage it for you as a service, or you can go out and buy boxes and have them on site. Obviously, with analog, you need something physical to plug into at some point. With the SIP devices, that can all be handled in the cloud now.
Yeah, and it's fair to say what we see in the market is a multitude of deployments. Really, it depends on whether the customer has a particular risk profile, they have a regulatory need to have uptime, but these same applications that provide the local connectivity for the variety of legacy devices are also there to do the same. And it's interesting, you can mesh that with Microsoft's sort of SIP offering as well. And I mean, Chris, have you yourself had much exposure to that platform in your line?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the SIP Gateway has provided like kind of a new lease of life, for Microsoft customers, and it's really opened the door to moving over to Microsoft Teams, because businesses, before SIP Gateway, they were kind of limited to just having direct routing and then patching it in that way. But Microsoft have broadened it over to their kind of standard offering, the calling plans, in order to be able to give them choice. Now that SIP gateway can really serve for two purposes. The first is, as Tom was talking about, getting them patched into SIP, kind of gateway, and having them for X period amount of time. But we're also seeing partners using them as a hop to going to Team certified devices as well. So they're saying, look, the SIP gateway is going to work out for us. It's going to be great as a kind of a stopping point for the next year or two. And then what I'm going to do is that we're then going to look about the device refresh. And I think that there was a lot of pressure from people like Tom and myself and other MVPs putting on Microsoft to saying, look, you can't just have this for direct routing. You need this for the call-in plans, but also as well, it's being fair to the customer, because look, lots of customers have invested their money into the hardware, and they need it to be able to work out for a period of time. So I think that the SIP gateway has been an excellent addition. And Tom, you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a big jump the last couple of years in terms of Microsoft's voice solution.
Yeah, they've been plugging the gap. So they obviously had the core basic knowledge worker functionality, and now bringing in things like SIP Gateway, and they brought in support for DECT, and they brought in support for analog. Those are some of the things that were causing PBXs to still hang around, that now just more and more of those blockers are being removed.
And the thing we're looking at actually with some of the SBCs we host for our customers, there is that middle ground where you've got the supported devices, the Polys, the Yealinks and such like, who are kind of aligned with that journey, and you've got some of the legacy vendors, maybe the Mitels, the Avayas and such like, who have got SIP devices. Now we are also, for a number of customers, looking at registering those into on-site SBCs or cloud-based SBCs, where the functionality is just the need to pick up and make and receive a call, because in fact the functionality is broadly there for what you need, and it helps protect that investment. It's quite an environmental way of going about things without having to sort of dispose of lots of old IT equipment, which is just sort of filling up desks. And it's really interesting what we're seeing in that space. I mean, look, Chris, the sort of the other second part of the sort of introduction, as I was talking about, the transformation that we've seen in the way collaboration has evolved from these early adopters, and what businesses are now looking to do. And I think the drive for simplicity is obvious, to bring everything into one application now. And this is where businesses have adopted early to go into collaboration tools. We mentioned the likes of 8x8 or RingCentral. There's lots of others out there. But now, as people are now using these technologies that people previously saw as how things may be, Microsoft is doing a lot of it. A lot of the stuff that maybe they were adopted for, that's what we're seeing. And so, where do you see Microsoft's energies going into further develop teams to increase this pace of transition for those customers?
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft have, from a marketing perspective, have said this time and time again about Microsoft Teams. They see it as what they call the front end. It's the place where people do work and they can do all their communication and they can do all their collaboration, whether it's within the organization or outside the organization. And we've seen those numbers rocket over the past few years. So if we think about, I remember being in Las Vegas for Microsoft Inspire in 2019, so right before the pandemic hit, and they'd just overtaken Slack by that time. So it was 13 million, and they had a big party, and they were saying, "Wow, we've got lots of people." And then right before the pandemic hit, it was 20 million, and a year later, it's 145 million users during the course of the pandemic. Now, for anyone who wants to know the latest numbers, is 280 million monthly active users. Microsoft see Microsoft Teams as that place where people work and collaborate. And in consequence, okay, Microsoft, because of the pandemic, went and gap filled in meetings and in calling. So they've evolved, particularly in the last few years, because many people had to work in a hybrid fashion. And so going back to that point that Tom made, if we were looking to take a voice solution with Microsoft Teams and it was 2017, it wouldn't be very well developed. In fact, when they started the move over from Skype for Business, it had big gaping holes in it. And if I was an organization and I managed UC, then I'd 100% go for a third-party solution outside of Microsoft for the kind of functionality that I wanted. But over the years, they've steadily plugged that gap and they've become more competitive than I think that a lot of people would have realized. In fact, they actually sit up the top of the Gartner index for UC, Tom, isn't that right? And they've added lots of great functionality in there. SIP gateway they've put in there, the intricate calling queue system and the auto attendants that they've got in there. They've plugged voicemail, they've plugged hold music, all these features that we've got.
You're definitely right, Chris. They plugged a lot of gaps. The other thing is the market's moved. Like when everybody went home in the pandemic, everybody got used to soft phone. They got used to meetings first. They got used to these functionalities, and suddenly going back and using like call pickup keys and like the kind of esoteric PBX features. Like I used to have endless conversations with customers about how we'd replicate all these, edge case PBX features. Just doesn't come up anymore. They're like, yeah, we already use Teams. Obviously we'll move to voice. So I'm sure that there are still requirements out there for those edge cases in certain customers, certain industries, but it's lower than it used to be.
So I see Mike Gilroy-Scott, our head of tech, has his hand raised. I saw a couple of questions pop in. Mike, were you going to want to answer a couple of these directly?
Yeah, I just thought they might actually, because I think you might be moving on to some of these questions earlier, but I thought I'd just point out Carrie has put in a good question about VoIP providers such as 8x8 are recommending that their integration to Teams along with their services is the way to go. Is there an obvious benefit to maintaining a VoIP provider alongside Teams calling? Is that a good time to discuss that, or do you want to pick that up once we move on?
So, I mean, Tom or Chris, why don't we start with Tom on this?
Yeah, so obviously those providers want to stay in the conversation, right? So they want to push their argument, and their argument would be 8x8 has way more, voice features and has different SLAs and different bits and pieces. So you can have the best of both. You can have Teams where you want to use it, and 8x8 where you want to use that. And because they're a direct routing provider, they can mix those two worlds together. So that would be what they would say. Obviously, Microsoft might say we think we can cover most of the bases without needing that. So it depends on your business use case. But I know 8x8 are doing very well in direct routing, where they have lots of customers who are doing a bit of 8x8, maybe 8x8 Contact Center, which is certified for Teams, and a bit of native Teams with direct routing.
And in fact, interestingly, I saw another question. Sorry, Chris, we're going to follow on from that.
I was just going to jump on top of Tom's there to a couple of reasons that I've heard, from discussions with customers, and one of them would be the third party provider, for example, 8x8. They would posit themselves that they specialize within that certain area. So they say, look, the reason why we exist is voice. Whereas the reason that Microsoft exists is for so much else other than voice. It's never going to ever be, as it were, the first thing when they think about. I mean, the counterpoint to that, for example, is Microsoft's network. So if anyone knows about the Microsoft's network and dark fiber network in Azure, I mean, it goes to literally it's so large, right? If you stretched it out, Microsoft's dark fiber network, you could go to the moon and back 3 times. But audio is optimized in that dark fiber network, right? So audio over everything, voice over everything, is prioritized in the Microsoft ecosystem. But the provider will say that our purpose is voice, whereas, and so that is one way that they would market it. Another way that I would have heard them is that they would have kind of almost like it's a relationship. It's the fact that you could be a bigger player in their pond as opposed to Microsoft, when we know that Microsoft, kind of deal with some of those biggest kind of customers in the world, people like Beulah that are 100,000, people in that organization. Tom, have you ever heard any of them kind of used before?
Yeah, a little bit. I just I was into the contact center conversation in the chat as well, but it's definitely, like, I think what you're saying is right. It's changing out there.
I mean, I think when we talk to customers, and there's a lot of businesses who have been on these legacy, or I say legacy, the original sort of disruptors, the 8x8 Ring Centrals, and yes, they have quite good integrations but they are equally, it's another application. You have to run it alongside your device. You have to manage that. You have to potentially pay more for it as well. And in fact, there's a few things coming in around contact center which I'm not fully reading. I think Mike and Tom, you're answering these, but it kind of comes onto the final section of the webinar, which there were 3 categories we sort of talked about, which was around integrations, call recording, call logging. And integrations could be CRM, it could be contact center. And so, where Formation fit into this story is we work with a lot of these ecosystem partners. Our job is to take, we take people to the cloud, to Microsoft and voice-enabled teams, amongst other things that we do. It's also about us researching, validating, and testing those different partners, the call logging providers, the call recording providers, and contact center providers. And in fact, a lot of where we started the business was taking contact centers to the cloud. And so I haven't seen the specifics of the questions coming through, but Microsoft have really opened up as an organization. They're very outward looking now, and where they don't do something that's native, the integrated contact centers, there's a variety of partners out there that do this, will sit and behave as if they are sitting in teams. So I mean, Chris, Tom, this is probably more your area on the contact center side, is it? Or do you have any comments around how, I can see some questions popping in and around, perhaps you're reading them, but just to answer that contact center integration in Teams piece, because it is a conversation that comes up quite a lot.
Yeah, just
so,
while he's, sorry, Tom, I was just going to say, yeah, a lot of the questions which Tom's trying to be answering is around 8x8 and their contact center. So we will try and get to all of the questions, but maybe if we sort of focus on the 8x8, Tom, on that, and just what their certification level is within Microsoft and how it differs from a sort of native contact center. Yeah.
Yeah, so Mark makes the point really well. So Microsoft is an ecosystem, so it's not like 8x8 or Cisco where you go and buy everything from one shop. They have APIs and they have a range of vendors, and they certify and approve those vendors to say yes, they've met the standards. They get a badge to say they work nicely with Microsoft. So interestingly, like 8x8, who are a competitor in the UC space, are also certified for contact center, which means they work with Teams. Now, there are different tiers of certification. It's probably a longer conversation in this webinar. But as Mark says, when you want to reach out to somebody who understands what the different options are, there are like 12 certified contact center vendors. There are 14 certified recording vendors. And then there's a whole bunch of other ecosystem around devices and reporting and analytics. So part of your team's journey is working out which ecosystem partners you need to get your exact business requirements. And the upside of that is lots of options, lots of price competition, lots of bespoke requirements to meet your needs. The kind of downside is that you do need someone to help you understand which might be best for your business or your organization.
Okay, was there another question there as well, Mike? Did you say?
I'm just going to jump back to one of the earlier ones. It's from a chap called James. He has an Alcatel Lucent PBX at the moment, desperate to move to Microsoft Teams. It says, have we heard of Rainbow, and any thoughts on this and the interim solution versus about an up-to-date replacement? Has anyone got any comments on that?
Sounds like a vendor or a partner. I'm not sure I'm not sure something I'm familiar with, but Tom or Chris, is this an area or product you've heard of, or partner?
No, not a name I recognise.
Okay.
I think, Tom, you've addressed the question about general reliability. I don't know if you want to just have a few seconds on that. that point?
Yeah, it's something comes up again. It comes up less than it used to be honest. So Microsoft have different SLAs for Office 365 and for Teams Phone specifically. And Teams Phone is 4.9. So that is the phone functionality. It doesn't mean the whole product, because the product's the integration of Office 365. I think, unless someone corrects me, they've still hit that every single time in terms of over the periods. But it's not 5.9s, which is the classic voice world. My kind of counter argument to that quite often is, well, if phones stayed up and everything else went down, would you be able to continue to operate? Like, can you operate without email and CRM and meetings and everything else? So, like, I think there are businesses where that's true. You go into like things like 999 contact centers and stuff. Like, there's a different level of service needed there. But again, I used to spend years back in the day talking about redundant IP switching and redundant power and keeping things up. And with everybody having cell phones and working from home and disparate internet connections, it seems to come up less. But happy to have that conversation with somebody if they've got specific requirements. Yeah,
and a lot of what we do for those situations is going back to the very first part of this conversation today, when we're deploying infrastructure on site that meshes with the cloud, whilst that can also be used to connect legacy devices in, analog lines or POTS, whatever. It does act as that secondary failover where if the Microsoft Azure is down, and it tends to make the BBC News when it's down, so no one tends to be in that much trouble if Microsoft is down, because it is a fairly sort of unique and fairly large event. But you can cater from that by having your trunks with other suppliers. So Gamma is a big provider we work with, where we connect them through cloud-based SBCs, and that gives you that level of resilience, which basically can build up to whatever extent you want to. Now, another area of the three sort of ecosystem areas we sort of highlighted in the beginning of this webinar was around call recording. Now, obviously, we're recording this webinar today, which we can share afterwards with either our clients or people on this event. But I mean, Chris, do you want to maybe cover a little bit of voice call recording? It's not a standard feature of Teams, but again, with the view to the ecosystem, it's something that we do a fair bit of. But do you want to perhaps give us a bit of background on that and a little bit of overview?
So sorry, Mark, just to catch you because you kind of blipped out there a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Call recording. So you can record video. That's standard. Voice is not a standard recording function of Microsoft Teams, and whether you need a compliance recording, whether you need it for training, whatever you need it for, it is a part of the wider ecosystem. I just wanted to kind of touch on that a little bit and get some thoughts from you.
Yeah, compliant call recording, I mean, it is a requirement for organizations because some organizations have to abide by compliance standards. Now, that could be their own standards or their own regulations internally, but it could be towards some kind of local government regulation. So that compliance call recording, there can be certain industries where it's absolutely necessary that every single call that you have is recorded, or let's say that you have a customer services function within that, every kind of call that comes in and out of the business, our business has to be compliant from a call recording perspective. Now, again, that can be, there are providers, as Tom said, that are certified, that are out there today that can plug into Microsoft Teams with compliant call recording. We've come a long way over the last couple of years because compliant call recording, you could only have it within what they call a direct routing model, where you bought your own PBX or you had a hosted provider of your PBX. You can now do compliant call recording into the calling plans as well as direct routing, and you can also have it with the operator connect as well. So we've seen over the last couple of years compliant call recording kind of go through the roof. However, if you do have the compliant call recording, you also have to be aware that the compliant call recording necessitates that you may not be able to have a few features, for example, in Microsoft Teams like end-to-end encryption, because with end-to-end, but when you're coming to make that decision, that's what the voice professionals are for. That is what people, like Mark and the team can sit down with you and they can go through the scenarios and go through your requirements as a business and translate how you work onto that with Microsoft Teams.
And coming up to the sort of final part of this webinar, I mean, we mentioned call logging as a component of the sort of ecosystem. Again, it's something that you get a lot of information in the Graph API that can get pulled out, and there are some specialist businesses that kind of work on that basis. I mean, Tom, have you got much to talk about in respect to call logging and where you see that in the market right now?
Yes, there's so obviously there's some basic reporting in the box with Teams, so you can pull your CDRs down. But as you say, they do have Graph API where you can pull much more detail out. So there's a number of products in the market that will do your CDR type reporting and even into session quality detail as well. So again, it's one of those plays where you can look at what's in the box. If it meets your requirements, great. If it doesn't, there's an ecosystem out there pulling that data and slicing and dicing it probably the way you want.
Yeah, and a bit like the old world sort of call loggers you might have had on an old PBX, the fundamentals of what you're trying to achieve hasn't changed. You still want to see who's missed the call, who's made a call, which groups are performing well, and you can get sort of real time or near real time from the experience that we've had, and that for where you've got a disparate workforce or you've got a customer services requirement can become really useful. I'm not sure that people always realise that's something you can actually enhance. And we often talk to Microsoft partners who've already moved to Microsoft with voice, and they've gone from very vanilla, like we moved to calling plans. It's cost them quite a lot of money, and they haven't necessarily looked at those wider parts of that ecosystem. And it's really interesting to see how those things bolt on. But we're coming up to the end of our half an hour here. And Mike, I don't know if there's any questions or whether we can perhaps answer those after the event and come back to the various parties.
No, Tom's been doing a great job of posting some
Okay.
links to some information thing. Although there is kind of, we've presented today some of the things which we think are the things that are holding people back. But I just wondered if anyone had any final thoughts. They're thinking of moving to Teams and they haven't. Have you got any specific reasons to the attendees today? This question is aimed at that you want to let us know. This is the reason why I didn't move to Teams. We've had a few concerns about reliability, etc., or if I want to go to a stepping stone first. Is there anything else out there today you want to just throw in the chat? We can discuss for a minute or two. Challenge us, as Tom says in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there are definitely probably business reasons out there, and there might be non-technical reasons as well. We're going to wait out our PBX maintenance, or we're waiting for an office move, or whatever it is. But I think the technical reasons are getting fewer and fewer, and I would sometimes challenge if it's like, because I need feature X, it's like, well, does the business need feature X, or have you always had feature X? Because there's a subtle difference in that answer. Like, just because you've always had it doesn't mean it's necessarily like business critical in 2023. That's always the fun conversation to have, I think.
Great. Look, I just wanted to say, some few questions coming in. Maybe we actually, address some of these on a one-to-one basis after this webinar, or we can perhaps just have another 5 minutes at the end. But just firstly, thank you everyone for joining today. It's been really great having you all along, and equally thanks to Chris and Tom for keeping their time and answering our questions and yours. So I had one sort of final question for both of you actually, which was, if you look at Teams, you look at it for 2023 and the year ahead, what in your mind, it might be something we've already spoken about, something we haven't touched upon, what is the most sort of exciting development you see coming in Microsoft Teams over this next year that's going to sort of continue this transformation and journey? Chris, you first.
Do you know what? And it concerns voice actually, and it is the integration, and it's quite topical, is the integration of AI. And I'll give you a kind of example about how this is going to work with an add-on called Viva Sales. So Viva Sales is part of Microsoft's Viva platform. If we can imagine that we're having a PSTN call using Microsoft Voice with Teams, and by using Viva Sales, that links it through to Dynamics, right? And when it comes to doing the recording of that call, AI is going to look through that call and look for action points and look for opportunities in order to basically take the conversation further. I'm looking at it from the voice being blended with AI to pick the pertinent information out and to be able to act quicker, because I'm quite a forgetful person. So if I got all the notes there without me having to sit through taking notes, I can listen to that person and I can have action points out the back that helps me to be faster and get back to that person faster. For me, that's a very exciting thing. And that's something we've never had before, right? In all of the voice systems, this is really kind of new world stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you look at quality assurance for sales teams, insurance, they have a percentage of calls they have to cover from a regulatory point of view. Some do 90%, some do 25%. Arguably, you could do 100% in that, right? And it comes to training, it comes to quality, it comes to regulation, everything. It's fascinating. And Tom, last word to you. So what is the exciting area you see of development that's worth talking about today?
Yeah, I think it's almost kind of cliche at the moment, but the whole OpenAI ChatGPT, the potential of that integrating across teams for both voice and meetings and collaboration is really, really exciting. I think the productivity benefits of having AI systems, be able to summarize your meetings or tell you what the actions were or help you get up to speed. Imagine if you joined a a new project, and you could have an AI summary of all the previous conversations that included the meeting content and the chat in Teams. I think we're going to see things like that in the future, and they'll be really exciting.
But Mike did share a little YouTube link for me for a guy who'd written some chatbot called Dave. I think he might have scraped it from one of your LinkedIn profiles, but it was an amazing sort of real person interaction between a human and a bot through Microsoft Teams using Azure communication services. It's unbelievable. In fact, maybe we'll share it through the link just for a 3-minute sort of peruse. But look, thank you again for everyone. We've got questions here we may not answer, but we'll be in touch and answer those directly. Please, we can organise some one-to-one sessions if there's some interesting points that you've heard today you want to discuss further. We obviously run these things fairly regularly as well, so we'll be sure to include you for future sessions. But again, Tom and Chris, thank you so much. Mike in the background, and everyone for joining. Thank you so much.
Right, thanks everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
Hello, guys.
Thank you. Cheers.
See you.
Bye-bye.